Okay, sweet. So if we haven't established it already, we are beyond thrilled to be here with everybody today. So thank you all for coming. We also want to let you know that should you work better with slides and speaker notes than looking at a screen, you can check those out at bit.ly/breaking-the-internet.
I am short. Okay. So, welcome to Remember When We Broke the Internet? Do you remember? It was just like a few seconds ago.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're not going to talk about how Amanda and myself have personally broken the internet, because we try to save that for maybe over drinks or dinner or something like that. But we're going to take a look at the times when open source, or something that looks very much like it, has broken the internet and has caused a disruption in our technological landscape. And that's not nearly as straightforward as the news articles and retrospectives and press releases would have you believe, because it's interconnected. It's a complex sociotechnical system that we're going to be looking at and seeing how it intersects with open source. So what you are going to see here in this talk might amuse you, or it might severely embarrass us. And quite frankly, I'm okay with either outcome. So take that for what you will.
No shame.
No shame.
No shame.
So I'm Julia. I've been working in or around open source for a while. And I am basically your standard multi-tool when it comes to open source. I just do what needs to be done, and then I go home and sleep. So.
And I'm Amanda. I'm fortunate that my work recently most focuses on understanding nuances of open source, where it works, where it needs support, and where are all the things that are holding up the internet in the back room that might be supported by things that were not intended to be that way, like racks of Coke. So before we jump into story time, Julie and I always like to start our talks off with level setting on foundational concepts to make sure that we're all on the same page.
So this is really dry, and I'm sorry. So most of us have this mental model of what open source might be in your own head, but there are strict criteria that must be fulfilled for something to be considered open source. So here we go. In order to be open source, code's got to be there. You have to be able to access it. You have to be able to edit it and distribute it. But it also cannot be specific to a technology, and it has to protect the integrity of the author's intellectual property. Open source does not mean that there is no intellectual property. There are no intellectual property rights here. And finally, you also have to include the license. This is the part that a lot of people ignore, unfortunately. And there are things that it can't do in order to still be open source. It can't discriminate against people, groups, or fields of use. That means you can't prevent industries that you don't like from using your software. So that's the dry part.
Right, we feel like it's super important to mention this as well, because Julie and I do use open source sometimes as like describing a community or a concept, but when we talk about open source in this talk, this is the very specific definition we will be referring to, as opposed to a more generous definition that might be included with other kinds of technology as well.
Yes.
Yes, so, okay. We will do a very brief introduction into complexity theory. And that's the conceptual framework which defines complex systems. So complexity theory states that while complex systems are unpredictable, they are constrained by order-generating rules. So a complex system has components that interact in multiple ways, following local rules, and there is no unifying rule to define all interactions. However, the emergent sum is still greater than the sum of its parts.
So now we have a special kind of complex system It's a sociotechnical system. You have noticed that some of those shapes have turned into people. You can't separate out the people, the social, and from the technical aspects of an organization. They're really tightly linked. Without the people, it doesn't work. So we need to ensure that when we think about these systems, that we account for the interactions between our society's complex structures and the behaviors of us, the people who live within them. So what does this have to do with open source?
Well, so if we examine the evolution as well as the individual layers of open source, we can see that they have components that interact. They have components that interact in multiple ways. They follow local rules. There's no unifying rule to define all interactions. And the emergent system is greater than the sum of its parts. So we can confidently say that open source is a complex system.
And if we want to really understand open source and how it changes, we also have to keep in mind that it is a socio-technical system. We cannot remove how we, as humans, interact with ourselves. I talk to myself all the time, each other, and the technical systems without really reducing the problem space to the point of meaninglessness. This is most important when disruptions in the system happen that fundamentally change the ecosystem.
So we're going to talk about some of these today. So we want to make sure we understand that when we talk about disruptions, specifically here we're talking about a disruption to an ecosystem that we would call a black swan event. And so these events are so special because there's a few critical components that exist for us to consider it a black swan event. So black swan events ultimately disrupt the status quo, cause systemic change, and seem inevitable in hindsight, which is my favorite part. So we'd like you to focus with you today on specific events in the history of open source, which highlight the complex socio-technical nature of our evolving ecosystem.
So in order to really understand some of these black swan events, we have to look at them in their historical context. Who here works in open source?
Or near it.
Or near it?
Yeah.
Okay. If you've worked in open source for more than maybe, 3 days?
Yeah, at least 72 hours minimum.
Yeah, you probably have stories about how it used to be when you started.
Right.
And if we look back further, as we try to do in open source science and open source archaeology, which is, we do a lot of that, we see how open source has changed over time, as well as where an evolution happens through a disruption of norms.
Oh, wait, so since we're talking about norms, this is super important, right? So we have to explain context. Like we always want to understand that things changed, but how did they change and why did they change? People look back and said that they should be able to see that. And normally we show this through a timeline. There's a great open source project Julia's working on right now. It's trying to collect all the events to create this timeline, and we've talked through that before, but I think we should use a different format. The timeline's good, but maybe a different format for this nice group of people because we're in person together.
No, it's special.
It is special.
Yes.
So what do you say?
Well, I think we could make that work.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think we should do?
How about a song?
We have great acoustics.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good in here. So,
Wait, is that a cat playing a piano?
it is!
Look, wait, let me rephrase that. Is that a cat head on top of Billy Joel playing a piano?
It is!
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Okay,
Let's do it.
fantastic. Awesome, okay.
Yeah.
So this is an audience participation talk. So, we will be singing the lyrics, which you will see, and we're gonna ask for your help on the chorus, which will also be up there. So if you know the tune, please sing along. If you don't know the tune, make up your own, and then still sing along.
We might do that too.
Yeah. So, okay, so notable events in open source cultural, political, social, and technological history. Antikythera, mathematicians, Ada Lovelace, difference engines, world wars, Alan Turing, Grace Hopper, D, bugs, public domain, ARPANET, now we can all typeset, software, copyright, like a book, not a light.
New guy comes on the scene. MIT license, Macintosh, Commodores, free software's on the run. Morris Worm licensing, GPL or BSD, Linux, Python, combat boots for everyone. Wait! We gotta go back. Okay, sorry, didn't mean to knock you over. time
We
warp.
don't want to hurt you in this talk. Okay, we're gonna go back to 1988. So, in 1988, there were about 60,000 computers connected together to form the public internet. And so there were an increasing number of industry networks, all selling the power of connection in the workplace, but a majority of these computers at the time were still government or academic systems. And so the Morris worm, or the worm, because it's so popular, it gets to own that whole title.
Popular is an interesting choice of words.
Right, maybe
Yeah.
infamous, famous, right? We can use a lot of different thesaurus words there. So, but it was created and inadvertently asterisk. And the asterisk here indicates a point that is contentious, but we all agree on to be congenial people. So it was inadvertently released by Robert Taplin Morris, who was a student at Cornell, but released the worm via a system at MIT in order to prevent it being traced back to him as a part of,
Inadvertently. Yeah.
as part of a research project examining internet systems and how their open protocols could be exploited, right? Makes sense. You want to be able to test things out in real time. But so it worked much quicker than Morris expected, and exploiting multiple operating system vulnerabilities, and most importantly, exploiting the transitive trust that existed at the time between sysadmins and users. The Morris worm infected about 10% of the global internet in a matter of days. And so there's many notable firsts from this event. That includes being the first computer worm to be distributed via the internet versus traded floppy disks or removable media. Morris was also the first felony conviction in the US under the 1986 Copyright or Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
This kind of goes back to the whole, there are rules created because of people's actions.
Right, so it is one of my life
Conversation.
goals to have a rule created because of my actions, which are kind but not hurting anyone. And yes, yes, exactly. Rules happen that we didn't predict. But so, what does this event matter to open source? And how is it a black swan event? So using our magical glasses of hindsight, we can clearly see that status quo was changed and influences how we operate today. So we do not assume that everyone is operating in everyone else's best interest on the internet. This event happened in November of 1988, and that was just months before GPL and Linux were released for the first time. So we can't ignore human interests, community expectations, and social trust that existed at the time of those releases, which were fundamentally impacted by the Morris worm. The reaction to and recovery from the Morris worm demonstrated the robustness of the internet when designed as a partitionable and distributed system, and that prioritized open knowledge sharing. So Morris quickly worked to move fixes to the worm onto multiple mailing lists, and sysadmins worked together to isolate damage and prevent impacted systems from infecting farther, which was great. But because of the Morris worm, the internet and the software which it runs on has fundamentally changed, right? So there's a pivot in security regulation and international laws at this time. We didn't want all systems to look alike anymore, so super homogeneity before was seen as an efficiency, now it's seen as a risk. And there's also a hard lean, especially in industry and government, to move to proprietary systems instead of open systems.
This was also in the best interests of the burgeoning tech industry at the time.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
It actually played very well into that strategy.
Right, right. But excitingly, now back to the song. So it's time for the chorus. Everyone who knows, please join in.
We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. JavaScript, Ruby, Murphy versus Libby, open source gets a name. CVEs ain't cheap. ASF and LF, PSF, what the F? TCP dump Trojan gets released for keeps. New guy drives away more women every day. Everyone's got a blog, maintaining is now a slog. Dive into vaporize, code of conduct's on the rise. Underpaid, undermaintained, open SSL compromise.
Wait.
Okay. So it's 2014. And 2014 was a very interesting year. And that was because of this one. This is one of my favorite examples when talking about open source as a complex socio-technical ecosystem. Heartbleed first came on the scene in 2012, actually, but was only publicly disclosed about 2 years later in 2014. And who has kind of like this visceral reaction to seeing this? I still have a visceral reaction to seeing this, and I'm still talking about it. So let's talk about Heartbleed. What was it? Well, it was an issue with one of the most popular open source cryptography libraries called OpenSSL. And essentially, it made user-entered data vulnerable to being captured by malicious third parties. With that data, bad actors could impersonate users, compromising even more information and security. This was bad. This was bad for trust in online systems. It was bad for trust in open source, et cetera. And because of the internet makeup at the time, it affected, at a minimum, 66% of the internet. Kind of back to some of that homogeneity issue. That included government databases that held information about residents. I'm sure they don't have anything sensitive in those systems. Wish they had learned, because that's happened a couple of times since.
Yeah, this is not the last.
Yeah, it's not the last. So Heartbleed was very high profile at the time. And it drew attention to the fact that while open source is a global ecosystem, it's got global participants, it is a rich area, and it's distributed, but the maintainership isn't necessarily. Very few people beforehand realized that OpenSSL was maintained by effectively one person at the time.
Effectively.
Effectively. So some articles will tell you two, but effectively one. And it was maintained entirely on a volunteer basis. And one of the great arguments in favor of open source, of which we are fans, is that many eyes make all bugs shallow.
Not a fan of that one.
Right, yeah. The fact of the matter is that a maintainer's time is limited. One of my projects says I'm perpetually oversubscribed. So, I have no time either. In OpenSSL's case, the maintainer didn't have enough time, given their day job that they needed to pay their bills and earn a living and all of that good stuff, to mitigate Heartbleed. And this resulted in companies paying for the core maintainer to take time off to work full-time on OpenSSL. And it increased interest in open source sustainability, supply chain analysis, and tooling. Even more companies that relied upon open source, otherwise known as all of them, saw sponsored development and open source contributions as an investment in their own stability and reliability and resiliency. We learned a lot from OpenSSL. But, serious part over, back to the song.
Yes.
Chorus time.
Again, sing along.
We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it.
Transitive dependencies, gnarly graphs not clean trees, naming things is tricky, left pad not in registry.
Wait. Okay, Amanda, we gotta stop.
This is getting more frequent now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, yes.
Okay, all right. So maybe that's a version of success.
It could be a measure of open source's
Right.
success.
Right.
But also, yeah, it's happening
okay.
a lot.
All right, so it's now 2016. LeftPad is the name of a package in the NPM registry, which is commonly referred to how the event is referred to. So in 2016, there's a trademark disagreement over an NPM package name, specifically not LeftPad. This is a different package name. And that when that was filed with the registry, this trademark disagreement, which was then and still remains privately held, NPM sided with the trademark holder. So in response, the maintainer of LeftPad and this other package and other packages deleted all of his NPM packages, including LeftPad. And this deletion from the package registry showed how LeftPad had become a transitive dependency for many other packages. So because of the way NPM references dependencies, it caused widespread failure in the NPM ecosystem and crashed many popular websites and services. But in response, NPM restored a version of that unpublished package without the maintainer's consent. So, okay, we're going to get in some asterisks and some parts here again where we like talk about things. So I do want to mention this had notable impacts both in open source and the Node ecosystem, which NPM is a part of specifically. So we do have to say that unpublishing code and releases was perfectly legal under open source terms and licensure. We've heard of the phrase free to fork, and that's with a little f and a big F, but what refers to the fact that licenses outline shareability or not, they outline reusability or not, and attribution or not. There's licenses that exist around all of these different concepts. Most notably here, this event put a bright spotlight on the Node.js development philosophy about how things are linked together, about reusability, about what you do versus what you just grab from someone else to do. And it also led to this was at a time that there was a decreased awareness of dependency complexity into these kinds of ecosystems. This really heightened that up. Julia talked about supply chains previously, a few years before this, but this really started bringing in, I think, more discussion around how we were thinking about these complex transparency pieces. But so we got another glimpse into increasing costs of maintainer burnout. We kicked off a new round of discussions around maintainer rights, open source contractualism. There's additional scrutiny placed around privately run package managers, which still is a contested discussion, especially as we talk about securing the open source supply chain. Oops, sorry. Okay, let's get started again, because I like the song best.
Okay. What was once community, now's become a strategy. Driving towards a stock exchange, yet another license change.
You have to stop again. You have to stop again.
So when are we stopping?
I mean, it's 2018, but it's kind of now. So it's
Yeah. Okay. So this is why we had the very, very dry intro to what is open source.
Right.
So we get into some controversial territory, which is my favorite type of territory. It's time for everyone's favorite technical topic, the legal side of open source. So we've done a great job, really A+ job of convincing people of the value of open source. We've got companies using it. They're using it more than ever before. Go us. But the pendulum may have swung a bit far. And what was once an expression of freedom, counterculture, and a bit of subversion became part of a business model. Companies developed open source software with the goal of monetizing it. Additionally, it was around the same time that the next big thing called the cloud offered companies a way to not have to be in the data center business anymore, which is great. It allowed small businesses to act like big ones. It gave them flexibility and the ability to focus on their core differentiation instead of optimizing for things that they really didn't care about as much. So service providers saw the opportunity to further take the load off of their customers by offering to run some of these open source projects as managed services. The consequence of this is that it effectively cut out the companies who developed the software from the equation. And then that meant that they missed out on the profits that they anticipated through their investment. So they explored other options, and in some cases, switched away from open source models altogether.
From that very specific definition.
From that very specific
Of
definition.
open source. Great.
So that is a dramatic oversimplification of the issue. And I have personal opinions on this matter, which are not uncontroversial themselves. But the long and short of an analysis will show that the cloud providers did exactly what open source allows them to do. Were they monetizing open source? Yes. Had others done this before them? Also, yes. Was it the same way that a proprietary product uses open source? Well, not necessarily. We had shifted, in part due to this whole cloud business, towards developer productivity. So developers were now the target audience instead of what was traditionally known as the end user. And so this was kind of novel for folks. But it had a tremendous impact on open source and the open source ecosystem. We saw and still see a muddying of the open source waters with the introduction of terms like open core and source available, as companies try to keep their reputations as open source companies without being fully open source.
By that definition.
By that definition.
Wait. Okay.
Yeah.
This is the last course. The last one coming up. So y'all did great on the first one. The second one, I gotta say, your energy was a little lower.
Flagging.
And that's fine. But we would really like you to bring it all out for the final chorus. That way you have all the energy up for the next speakers. So please bring it all together. Let's try one more time.
We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. But when we are gone, it will still burn on and 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 on. Woo! Good job, y'all. So, just like the song, we could go on and on and on and on and on. Mostly because the internet keeps breaking.
And people keep doing things creatively.
Yeah, I mean,
to express themselves and be a part of a community. And that
Absolutely.
doesn't always match with what was previously existing.
we always push the bounds of what is possible.
Right, can't
And
ignore the
that's-
people.
Yep,
Yeah.
motivations. There are fundamental challenges which exist in the larger open source ecosystem, which are accelerating black swan events.
Right, so I think as a part of this too, we just don't want to talk about the things that are either sad or hard, but also want to offer a few, as we think about complex systems, we think about mitigations and perturbations, small things you can change to try to make a larger system move towards a greater goal. So we'd like to talk about a few of those perturbations that we think could fundamentally shift us towards a new future.
So part of the open source ethos is transparency, but for some reason we primarily focus on code. The rest of how open source operates is oftentimes lost to walled gardens, off-the-record chats, and an over-indexing on source control as the only source of truth that matters. We need to bring transparency more into open source, bring it into the aspects of open source that are still currently in the dark. We need to reduce the ways We need to explore the ways that open source need to evolve in order to reduce the frequency of these black swan events. Transparency is not a core tenet of open source anymore. but it should be.
Right, and so glue work is the phrase created by Tanya Riley to describe the work that can mean the difference between a project that succeeds and one that fails. So when we talk about maintainability and sustainability, there remains a focus on certain forms of contributions. And even with the binary categorization of code versus non-code work, which you'll hear me frequently rail against, feature work and advancing new versions of a package are given more visibility than the glue work, which enables our entire ecosystem. So glue work is not visible as the critical, essential work of open source, but it should be.
So this is one of those things that nobody wants to talk about. The history of open source, like most histories, are told from one perspective. And that hampers our ability to both reason about how events have come to pass, as well as it influences our technology decisions in the future. Open source has a cult of personality problem, and that contributes to problems in sustainability, reliability, and the overall longevity of our ecosystem. So we need to shine lights on these missing or untold narratives, including the glue work that makes open source go. This may seem at odds with calling out the cult of personality problem, but there are two sides of the same coin. An imbalance in celebrating these untold stories leads to some work being undervalued and flashy kind of credit-baiting work being overvalued. It's a sustainability, reliability, and longevity problem. Narratives are not complete, but they should be. So we didn't light this fire, but we're staying to fight it, and we hope that you do too.
Thanks.